I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, here at Devex World 2018. We're in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by Wil Hylton, who is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and a well-known journalist for lots of things that you've covered around the world, but in particular I want to talk about your incredible recent piece on Venezuela called Can Venezuela Be Saved? You actually were able to interview Leopoldo Lopez, who's the opposition leader. He's under house arrest. Tell us about that story, first of all, for those who haven't heard about it or read it, and who is Leopoldo Lopez and where does he fit into this story?
So Leopoldo Lopez is a political prisoner in Venezuela. He was initially a mayor who was sort of on his way to the presidency. He was the mayor of a Chacao district of Caracas, which is sort of like being the borough president of Manhattan.
Okay.
I mean, on the one hand, it's just a neighborhood. On the other hand, it's
an important
a
neighborhood.
stone. Yeah. And he was seen sort of as the rising star who would be eventually challenger to Hugo Chavez. Mm-hmm. This was in the early 2000s. And he was banned from running for office, banned from the political process altogether. And over the last 4 years has been held under prison and house arrest as a way of preventing him from even contributing to the discourse of Venezuelan politics. So for people who don't really understand Venezuela, that's kind of a glimpse of how repressive things have become.
How did you manage to actually talk to him? Tell us about that part for people who haven't read the story.
I followed this long daisy chain of people who had known him in the United States, making one introduction after another. Some were just friends, others were lawyers who had been involved in his case in the past, and finally ended up trading messages with him, first over text because he had a discrete connection to the web.
Okay.
He's been banned from speaking to journalists, obviously, but we ended up creating a encrypted channel for video chats. And for months we were able to get online. I mean, we'd get blocked by the Sabine secret police sometimes. They'd come around and figure out a way to sort of jam up his internet connection. But he always found a way to make the contact again. Okay. And so we recorded hundreds of hours of interviews, and I was just trying to use his story and his experience as a way of understanding what sort of happened in Venezuela. Venezuela is not as much on the radar as we might hope for a country that's currently experiencing the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
I mean, we're seeing refugee numbers pouring across the Brazilian and Colombian border at numbers that are comparable to the Rohingya fleeing into Bangladesh, comparable to the Syrian refugee crisis, but they're not getting that kind of attention. And so to me, talking to Leo was a way of kind of creating a frame to talk about Venezuela.
And do you feel like, in terms of the crisis now, you're talking about comparing it to the Rohingya refugees, it is a really serious crisis. Are we at the peak of that crisis in your view?
It's unfortunately not. We are not. It is escalating still. So I was down in Cucuta, Colombia, which is the biggest border town. There are 3 main crossings from Venezuela to Colombia, but if you cross any of them, you sort of end up in this town of Cucuta. And I was speaking with the bishop there, the Catholic bishop, who has great contacts at the border stations.
Sure.
And he was saying that the number in the last 6 months has risen from about 40,000 refugees coming in on a weekend to about 80,000. So we've doubled. And it's still going up. And there's really no reason to expect that to improve. It's now being done more in the greenways because under Santos, the Colombian government has restricted access through the bridges. With the same number of migrants are traveling across streams and gullies.
And that more dangerous
much
transit.
Much more dangerous, yeah. And so, the loss of the sort of brain drain in Venezuela is extraordinary. I mean, you're just seeing all sectors of society pack up and leave. And if we don't figure something out, we're going to lose a country. We're going to end up with a failed state right here in the Western Hemisphere.
And what does that mean to figure something out, right? We're here at this Global Development Conference, yet I feel like people don't talk that much about the crisis in Venezuela. It's seen as kind of an issue apart. And maybe the idea sort of gets back to the headline of your great story, Can Venezuela Be Saved? It feels like maybe people have said no, and we'll just have to wait for this to play itself out.
Yeah. I think Venezuela, it's relatively simple to figure out how Venezuela could proceed under new political leadership. So the currency crisis, the inflation crisis, I mean, they have the highest levels of inflation in the world.
Right.
These kinds of things, they're sort of solved mathematical problems, right? If you handle the economy in a different way, and I don't mean wild, unrestrained capitalism, I just mean that other countries have dealt with this issue and have figured out ways of stabilizing currency. The Maduro regime, the current government of Venezuela, is resistant to any of the measures that could be implemented for that effect. The Maduro regime has also kind of created an uncanny valley for humanitarian aid, so that there are containers of humanitarian supplies waiting in neighboring countries to go into Venezuela, but Venezuela will not accept them. Venezuela will not accept UN refugee camps, which could be placed on the Venezuela side of the border for people who get that far and
before crossing,
before the country loses them altogether. And so the challenge, I think, for humanitarian groups is how to figure out how to get across that gap from mobilizing and developing a plan of action for sort of post-Maduro Venezuela, but to figure out how to begin that process, right? Because we've got the plans in place, but it's very hard to know how to implement them.
Right, everyone's waiting for Maduro to basically leave or be deposed in some way, and then you can kick into gear.
And it's almost like it doesn't matter which other political party takes over, because they all have plans, they're all different plans, some will work better than others, but many of these problems are in fact extraordinarily tractable. They can be addressed much better than the current regime is addressing.
Well, Venezuela is a country with the largest oil reserves in the world. It was a pretty advanced economy, and it's been sort of intentionally brought down in a way.
It was really the envy of Latin America.
Yeah.
And they have the largest oil reserves in the world, which they're not pumping. And so, if PDVSA, the oil company, weren't run by a military general with no experience in the oil sector, they might be able to get a little more of that oil out of the ground and use it for whatever purposes the government considers politically appropriate.
Yeah.
Those kinds of debates can be had in a country, but certainly you would like to make use of the resources you have, and they're not doing that.
Is there anything you think could be done, either diplomatically or through the development and humanitarian sectors? Obviously, it's very hard to find a solution to this kind of at the level of the U.S. State Department. Maduro's dug in, and this has become a real conflict. Is there an angle where NGOs, development organizations, the Inter-American Development Bank, those kinds of organizations could play a role here?
I think to the extent that it's possible to work with the church, that's one really useful way. The Venezuelan church has become much more willing to step forward and make statements that are critical of the regime, take actions that are not beloved by the regime, and I think that that's going to be an avenue by which humanitarian aid can begin to flow.
Okay.
I also think that within the border areas in Brazil and particularly in Colombia, humanitarian organizations need to be there to catch the refugees who are arriving. There's not been great work on that.
Okay.
Neither Santos nor Maduro has done a great job on this, and we're about to see the second round of the Colombian presidential elections.
Just 5 days from now.
Yeah, and we'll see whether the new administration is more willing to bring real aid to the border and not just step up police presence to try to stop migration. But
yeah, it is a remarkable thing. I've been in Colombia many times over the last few years and seen. I remember meeting somebody in Cartagena, a young man. He was selling water on the street from Venezuela. Like so many other people, you meet vendors on the street there who are from Venezuela. And he told me his story was that before fleeing, he took the wheels off of his truck, because his truck was his one asset, his prized possession, and he dug a giant hole by hand and buried his truck.
Wow.
And covered it up. And his hope is to one day return to his country and
get
dig
his
it
truck
out.
back. Wow.
And it's those kind of human stories that just give you a sense of how significant the challenges really are, and multiply that by millions of people now who are facing this kind of a real crisis in their lives.
And the story you just told, I mean, telling these stories, I think, is a big part of what we can be doing.
Yeah.
I think raising awareness right now is extraordinarily important, because there are levers that governments can move.
Yeah.
For example, the Organization of American States is now talking about, as of a few days ago, is talking about investigating human rights violations by the Maduro government. As public pressure mounts on political leadership, we will see more political action to put pressure. And so far we've seen sanctions. We've seen in the Lima Group, we've seen denunciations. We're starting to see denunciations from the OAS.
Right.
But these political organizations will not continue on the path they're on or escalate pressure without public pressure.
Right.
And so I think a lot of times what what humanitarian organizations can do, what NGOs can do, is bring stories forward, is go places, see things, and report back on what's happening.
Well, that is something we will continue to do at Devex. I want to thank you for being a part of Devex World today and bringing the Venezuela story here.
My
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.